This is the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome back to the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined by Rob Riches and Dan Heaning. It's been a while for the three of us, and we do apologize for the hiatus, but we are glad to be back with you. So we're back fittingly at the time of year when we started last year. The NHL Draft is coming up on Friday night and Saturday morning into the afternoon. The Flyers have 2 picks in the first round, getting the 14th overall pick from the St. Louis Blues as part of last year's Braden Shen trade. And this is essentially Ron Hextall's time of year. We've talked about it before, how he thrives in this situation, but it's also a very different situation than last year. The Flyers really had everything fall into their laps with the second overall pick, and there were really 2 obvious choices, and the Flyers were going to get one of them, and they did in Nolan Patrick. This year, the Flyers have 2 picks in the middle of the round, which leaves a lot of scenarios in play, a lot of options available in using the picks, and quite honestly, a lot of unpredictability. There's really not much of a way to predict where this is all going to go and what Ron Hextall has up his sleeve. So let's get right into things, and guys, I'm curious, before we get into some of the specifics of the draft, where your thoughts are heading into this draft. We've certainly had a lot of time to reflect on the previous season and watch as the rest of the playoffs unfolded. So what's the mindset entering the draft and the state of this team going into the draft? For me, I think it's about seeing progress, truly seeing progress among bringing kids into the picture and getting them into roster spots first and foremost. You're building a team, so getting them into roster spots is big, but there's obviously more to that. And guys, I'm just curious as to the way that the season ended and the playoffs went and everything like that. What do you guys think about the state of this team as we head into draft weekend?
The first thing that jumps to my mind, particularly for this draft, is this is probably the first draft for the Flyers that I can remember this is just the best player available type situation, where they don't have to reach for anybody. Like last year, they had to kind of reach for size because they didn't have any big forwards at all. And then this year, they could just kind of roll with it. Hextall stressed at a press conference that they need to get some centers and some more defensemen to replenish. But you could just fall into those guys. Like half of the kids that go into the draft and that are really highly touted are considered centers to begin with. So this is really a situation unlike most that Hextall has been in, where he can just pick the best player and not have to reach for a goaltender or any kind of forward or defenseman.
Let's not forget, as far as talent is concerned in the draft, you remember previous drafts. I mean, 2016, 2015, you had a lot of players in those drafts considered, there was a lot of hype surrounding him. They were very highly touted. And last year, there was a little bit of a step back as far as that concerned. And this year, it's one of those things where you don't really know necessarily what to make of that, because you do have a lot of guys like Rasmus Dahlin, who's, according to Erik Karlsson, projected to be better than Erik Karlsson. And a lot of guys who are projected to make an impact and could be NHL ready, but still, you still also have your mix of guys that aren't exactly as touted or as hyped up either. There's kind of that in between mix. So it's one of those things where when you have a prospect cupboard as stacked as the Flyers have, you want to keep adding to that. You want to try to identify that talent. And as piggybacking off of what Dan said, you want to find the best player available. So it's one of those things where it's kind of the position that the Flyers in. It's there's a lot of, I feel, hit or miss picks in this year's draft, and we'll see how it plays out.
I'm kind of with you, Rob, on one part of this. And you mentioned the drafts, not necessarily going back to last year, but go back to 16 and 15 and things of that nature. The mindset for the draft, in my opinion, should remain similar to previous years in the sense that they've always come out and said they're going to take the best player available. Some years it's easier to do than others. Obviously, last year, you know who you're taking. You're taking what was left of the top 2. That's easy. But in other situations, you look at 2015, that was a really good draft class, the 2015 draft, because the Flyers come in with the 7th pick. They had a late first-round pick, too. They get Ivan Provorov and then found a reason to trade up in the first round later with that 2nd pick to get Travis Konechny. And you've got 2 players that are already making an impact on your active roster just 2 years down the road from that draft. That's obviously a huge impact. 16 to me was a lot different, and I liken it a lot to that in a sense, because once you get to the middle part of the first round, in a lot of situations, and 15 was kind of the exception here. You find these players who are not necessarily going to be projected to be superstars. You're not going to find a superstar on paper today at 14 or 19. You might get one through development, through years of molding into the type of player that they're meant to be and being put in the right situation. It's happened. It can happen with mid-round picks, let alone mid-first round picks. But you're not going to get somebody who on paper is going to be projected to be what Rasmus Dahlin is and be this potential generational talent or be this next biggest thing at defense or anything like that. So I think there's something to bear in mind with that, and it leaves all options open. You definitely want to keep building what you've started. If you're on Hextall, you want to keep building this thing from within with draft picks. There's no arguing that. What you have now, I think, is more options to do different things. It's okay for you to pursue the option to move up and get aggressive while recognizing the potential costs. You don't want to be too thrifty with everything, but you also don't want to overpay just to move up for somebody who you think can make that kind of an impact. But it's also okay to still be a little conservative, trade down from one of those picks. More likely, I would say 19 than 14, but trade down from one of those picks to acquire more picks and still get a player that you think you want. I liken that to 16 when the Flyers had the 18th overall pick. They dropped to 22, and you're able to pick a guy in Yerman Rubtsov who they wanted all along, and they said that. He was there at 18. They felt like they could get him at 22, and they did. Now, when you look back on that particular pick, it's not really a sexy pick because of the fact that Rubtsov's just now going to be entering into that stage where he's turning pro and becoming a professional player, and he didn't even really get a chance to do what some of those kids do from juniors to the pros and get that AHL tryout period after their junior season ends, the way that Isaac Ratcliffe got a chance to do that this year, and Morgan Frost and Carter Hart got to practice with the team during the playoffs, even if they didn't really get into a game. It's that kind of experience around a professional team that Rubtsov still didn't get because of the run in the Memorial Cup that Acadie Bathurst had. It's just the way that it goes. So, but he's always going to be projected to be more of a depth guy, and you might be finding more depth guys here. You want to look at what you've started to build through the draft, and you look at how Sean Couturier played, and you look how Travis Konechny played, and you look at how Ivan Provorov's played, and you've got a lot of these foundational guys in place. Now you're also pulling some guys, especially in these mid-rounds, and don't want to leave out Nolan Patrick in that either. Nolan Patrick's obviously a top-end guy being a second overall pick. This is where you start to fill in even more spots here and try to figure out down the road who's going to fill some of these depth spaces. Whoever they draft, wherever they draft this player, whether it's somehow moving into the top 10, whether it's 14 and 19, whether it's lower, these players are not going to be in the conversation to make the roster next year. They are going back wherever they came from, whether it's playing in a European league or playing in juniors. But at the very least, you're going to be able to be able to continue building on this foundation of good prospects. You can replenish the center role. Dan, I agree with what you said about how a lot of these kids come in and they're listed as centers, but that doesn't mean that they're hardened to that position. They're flexible in playing other forward positions. It's more unlikely to find a player who's already identifying with that wing spot and purely a left winger or purely a right winger. You're more likely to find a kid who's played some center, some wing, and is kind of in a hybrid role, ready to come in and do just about anything. So Hextall's big thing is still replenishing the center position and trying to find maybe a right-handed defenseman, because right-handed defensemen kind of come few and far between. There's a few good ones that are a little bit high in the rankings for the Flyers to be looking at 14. It's just, that you're going to probably have to get into the top 10 to get a couple of those. You'd be lucky if one of them slipped as far as 14 for sure. But you can try to make it a push to get those, to fill those needs at some point on draft weekend and still do what you're setting out to do and keep building this thing. More or less, and I want to see what you guys think about this, but I think that from a standpoint of the state of the team, the fact that you've gotten kids onto the roster is a big step, but now you need to start seeing them take on the bigger roles too. And you started to see that at times with Konechny, with Provorov. These are guys who are playing big minutes. Provorov at times is pushing 28 to 30 minutes a game in that top pair defenseman role, and Konechny getting that first line time at points during the season. More or less, you need to stick with that and increase the playing time, increase the situational play. And that's not Ron Hextall's job. That's Dave Haxtell's job. And that's probably a topic for another day. But still, I just want to see where you guys are with what the team is now and then what they're looking to add as part of this weekend and some of the things that come into play where those lines kind of cross and you go current roster and people who may not be around for the foreseeable future.
Well, in terms of, young players, taking on a bigger role, I absolutely love the idea of Nolan Patrick playing more minutes. He got himself up to, the second line center role towards the end of the season. He started really playing well in it. He played excellent in Wayne Simmons' spot on the first power play. So I don't think there's anything really wrong with the way Dave Haxtell is handling a good chunk of the young players. Now, there's a debate with Travis Sanheim versus playing a Brandon Manning, but that's a topic for another time. But you have the young players like Travis Konechny and Ivan Provorov, like you said, Kevin, and then you have players like Nolan Patrick who are playing. These kids are getting chances, and once they earn the trust of Dave Haxtell, and it takes a while for young players to earn his trust, apparently. But once he trusts those young players, they play and they play well. You can see, the headache that Shane Gostisbehere had in a sophomore season. He didn't have that. He didn't have that in this past season. He was a top pairing defenseman for the Flyers pretty much the entire season. So in terms of replenishing what you have at defense in this draft, so you can keep, having defensemen in the pipeline and keep restocking just in case like a Sam Morin doesn't work out. That's kind of something that you really want to look at towards the future. And then short term, you need an upgrade at third line center, definitely. And I don't know if you feel that this weekend, because I think that you can pick up a guy maybe like Riley Nash in free agency and go that route. If you don't go towards the AHL and pick up a kid from there like Mikhail Vorobiev.
And let's not forget, as far as younger guys kind of increasing their roles is concerned, I mean, it's one of those things where eventually, you're going to have to get to that point. You have these younger players that just keep, you look at guys like Provorov and Konechny, they're coming up on their third NHL seasons. They haven't exactly seen everything, but they've seen a bit so far. It's one of those things you're able to kind of keep track of their progress. You're able to see how they're doing, and now that they have several 2 seasons of NHL experience under their belt, and obviously Nolan Patrick, who was really finding his groove as last season progressed. It's interesting to see how he can bounce back, or I don't want to say bounce back necessarily, but how he can respond in his sophomore season. Everybody wants to hype up the sophomore slump cliches, but I don't know if that's something he's going to have to deal with. I mean, he's one of those guys where we've seen how good and how good he can develop over the course of the season, and I'm very excited to see how he can pick that up into the next year. And when you look at the blue line, these the young defenders, Gostisbehere, Robert Haig, Provorov. When you have these younger defensemen, even if Sanheim can work his way into the mix, it's one of those things where you're gonna, if your blue line is leaning so heavily on these younger players, and you're gonna have to. When you're hitching your wagons to these young guys on the blue line, they're going to need to, continue to progress, and we've seen how that can go, and that's something where I'm curious to see how those guys, especially. I mean, you look at how steady Robert Haig was looking at points last year. He's one of those guys where I'm curious to see how he can continue from there, and obviously with the blow Delta Samuel Morin, there's going to be some more opportunities for these guys. Not as much competition, unfortunately, but these guys are going to be able, I think, to make that jump and be able to step up and progress and entering next season.
Yeah, and I mean, especially when you look at the back end and the defensive play and a lot of resting a lot on these younger kids, it's a spot where the Flyers could, and again, right now we're focused on the draft and that's coming up this upcoming weekend when free agency starts to kick in the following week and we reconvene and talk more about that. Yeah, sure. You're going to talk about the possibility of adding a depth defenseman, and you're going to talk about the possibility of adding kind of that low line center type role that you want to fill and try to fill effective immediately. In the same sense, we're talking about how right-handed defenseman is a role that, or a position kind of need. The shot selection or the way a player shoots left or right isn't really something that's in anybody's control. And if you're gonna pick the best defenseman that's available in one of your spots where you pick, then you got to take that out of the equation, whether you need it or not. You're gonna pick talent over handedness, obviously. But I look at what the Flyers are talking about when they say they're looking for that, and basically what I think they really are saying they're looking at for that is beyond the first round. You want to find somebody who's a right-handed defenseman who you can bring into the system that replaces Phil Myers, because Myers is rapidly climbing up and knocking on the door, and it's too soon to say whether or not he's going to make this team next year, but he's closing in on it. He's going to get a look in training camp, a long look probably, and anybody, kid or otherwise, it doesn't really matter who it is. If anybody goes down early in the year, midway through the year, and Myers isn't up yet, he's probably the first one getting a call. And you're getting closer to that part of it. And Myers it's easy to forget this sometimes, but Myers was an undrafted free agent signing, and he's a right-handed defenseman, and they're very valuable to teams. So to find a guy like that and have a find like him as an undrafted free agent is a big deal. And he's knocking on the door. He's getting closer, and I think you want to bring in a guy who kind of fills that spot behind him in the prospect pool. There's not really a whole lot of guys that you can pinpoint that are kind of knocking on the door of the NHL like that. A lot of the defensive prospects that the Flyers have that were close to getting to the NHL are essentially here, even down to Sanheim and Myers and guys like that. If you're looking at anybody who they drafted fairly recently, they're probably either playing still in juniors in some capacity, or they're where the Flyers got kind of very heavy on the European prospects, and there was, they selected 2 Swedish defensemen a few years back, things like that. These are kids that are playing over in those leagues, in European leagues, and aren't really factoring into immediate plans at that time, or not really comfortable with the North American game at that point to be able to talk about them in that conversation. So you might be looking for a piece here that you can just bring in and essentially put right behind a guy like Myers in that discussion as a right-handed defenseman, because they're few and far between. But otherwise, I think this is just about trying to stay the course and keep finding good young prospects to round out the pool. It's not really about thinking about positional need for next season. I don't see Ron Hextall making a trade that fills one of those roles. I don't think you're going to make a trade and trade away draft picks because you're looking for a third center. I think if you're going to do anything like that, then you're going to acquire a player who does make you better immediately, but who fits into a bigger role than that from the get-go, not somebody who fills more of a depth role and you're giving up picks to do it. I think that they would focus on something like that in free agency, and there's enough guys that are going to at least test the market in free agency. I feel like one of the things that we've seen in the couple of weeks since the Stanley Cup final ended is that there's been relatively not that much activity among players who have the ability to sign and re-sign with their current teams. It seems like a lot of players are going to let this week kind of come and go, get to next week where that discussion period opens before players can officially sign with teams on July 1st, and kind of test the waters here a little bit of the free agent market, see who's interested, see what people are offering. And there are going to be guys that are worth discussing for sure as that time moves on. But you look at something like the reports that come out about Wayne Simmons possibly being available. Is he on the trading block or not? There's nothing, no team is going to confirm that they're actively shopping somebody hard or soft on that, where they're trying to go all out to find a trading partner, or they're just throwing it out there. But you understand the method behind this, and you go, here's a player who came off a year where he wasn't as offensively successful as he had been. He's in the last year of his contract coming up. And if you know that you're not going to do much with him, or if you don't feel like you're going to be able to re-sign him beyond next year, you have enough players who are going to need to be tended to in this spot. You're going to start to see following next season the rookie contracts start to expire, and you're going to need money to keep these players, these very talented young players like Provorov, like Konechny, around either on bridge deals at that point or long term. And you're going to figure that out as the year goes on. I don't really see them doing too much to play with this stuff in this offseason. I think you're going to let everything play out. You're going to see what you've got. You're going to analyze the whole body of work from these kids before you offer them the next deal. Very much like what the Flyers did with Shane Gostisbehere. You're going to take a look at the whole body of work and understand that in a sampling of 3 seasons, technically, if you want to count Gostisbehere's first professional season, which lasted all of 7 games, you're looking at what's the whole body of work. He had an injury. He came back from that injury very well, had an amazing rookie season, and then his sophomore season wasn't that great. You extended him to a reasonable contract. It's longer term than many would expect. It basically skipped the bridge deal option and was a long-term deal. But he came back this year and had a very solid year and was the player that you saw more of in his rookie season than you did in his sophomore season. That's all you can ask for out of those kind of deals, and hope that the progression sticks. So there's so many things that come into play with this. And I think one of the encouraging things is that the Flyers last year, approaching this weekend and approaching free agency, they were busy. They were really busy in locking up players that they wanted to bring back. You saw them give Gostisbehere the deal. They re-signed Jordan Wheel. They took care of a lot of those loose ends before they got to free agency. And by the time they got to free agency, there really wasn't much to do beyond sign a second veteran goalie. That was about all that was left. So that was what they did. This year, I think they're leaving a lot more open for discussion and to see what's out there, potentially to either fill those spots internally with players who are coming up through the ranks, or to go out and get 1 or 2 free agents here. You know, I'm not going to cap it at 2, but you're going to go out and you're going to look at free agents, and you might bring in somebody who's on a reasonable deal, who fills that depth role and who gets that done. I certainly have people in mind, but let's get through the draft weekend first and see kind of who's left standing and who survives and everything like that before we really get into the heart of what free agency is going to be. And not to mention that there is still a whole week left before teams, roughly a whole week left, and counting. And there's a whole week left where players might be able to discuss with their current teams and discuss with other teams what the market's like. But that still leaves a good chunk of time before that July 1st opening for free agency for players to re-sign and no longer be available. So to try not to get too much into that, let's get back to more of what's the focus for the upcoming weekend and the NHL draft. And let's talk prospects and targets in the draft. We've already mentioned it several times. The Flyers have the 14th and 19th overall pick. Perception is it's a solid draft class. Ron Hextall called it above average at his recent media availability. And basically at this point, guys, we've touched on it a little bit with the approach, maybe some of the best player available, the positional discussions that Hextall was talking about, or with the notes that he made on we might be targeting more centers and defensemen. But what's the approach going into these 2 picks on Friday, and then who are some of the prospects that we should be watching out for and looking for the Flyers to target?
Well, one of the things I wanted to do, Kevin, is kind of bring this thing full circle, because there was a lot of things that, you touched on there in terms of like being aggressive and conservative. Like which way can you really go with this draft? Because this is unmarked territory here for Ron Hextall, where he can he has 2 first-round picks. He has Wayne, like you mentioned, you don't know what's going to happen with Wayne Simmons. So you can kind of package 1, maybe even all 3, to try and move around. And you mentioned the right-handed defenseman, so as an organizational need. And before we went on the air, I was talking about potentially using all 3 to try and get Brady Tkachuk, but Brady Tkachuk probably won't make it past top 5. But there's a right-handed defenseman in Evan Bouchard that you could try and package maybe the 14 in Wayne Simmons and do that. I was just kind of curious as to how do you think the Flyers should attack that? Is right-handed defenseman so crucial that you should, try and move up using the 14th pick or maybe the 19th pick or Wayne Simmons to try and get an Evan Bouchard, or, just kind of stay the course and let the cards fall where they may, so to speak?
My thought coming into this whole thing was that it depends on the situation. If you're sitting at 14 and chances are nothing's going to happen in any form of trade talk before we hit 7:30 Friday night. You're going to get to 7:30 Friday night. The first pick is going to be, the Buffalo Sabres will go on the clock and they'll probably select Rasmus Dahlin. That's going to happen, and I don't see much happening from there. But obviously, when you're sitting in 14 at that point, you've got to let the board play out and see where it goes. The one thing that's the unknown is we don't know who the Flyers are looking at on their board and how they have everybody ranked individually. Their rankings are going to be different from the rankings that we've seen from many different other sources and many different other resources that we use to gather some information about the draft eligible players and things of that nature. My thought is that if anybody, and I look at right-handed defensemen not as a priority, it's more just a focus. It's something to take note of. I'm sure that there's certain ones that you kind of circle a little bit more and you go, if something happens, keep an eye on where this name may fall. It's really interesting because there's two really solid right-handed defenseman prospects that are both projected top 10 in many different ranking systems and different situations like that. You mentioned one of them, Dan, in Evan Bouchard, and certainly he's one of the top prospects that is a right-handed defenseman that falls into that top 10 category. Noah Dobson's the other, and my question in that situation is, Dobson really got kind of an extra showcase with the Memorial Cup. He was a teammate of Rubtsov's with Acadie Bathurst and all of that. So Dobson kind of gets that boost of being relevant at this time because of the fact that he played the longest and the latest of any of these top prospects. You look at Bouchard and you wonder if he's the forgotten one out of this. All of a sudden, Dobson becomes maybe a top 5 projected, and in a place where Bouchard was previously. Now Dobson's taking that spot, and Bouchard starts to fall down the list a little bit. I don't think he falls outside the top 10, and my point in looking at a trade-up situation is that even in the best case scenario, whatever you try to package, whether it's both picks, whether it's one pick and a player like Wayne Simmons, whatever you decide to do in trying to create a package if you were to move up, I don't think you're having a discussion with any team that's going anywhere until we're looking at 8th or 9th in the draft. So I think you can take the top 7 clear out of play unless you're really going to make some sort of offer that is going to knock a team off of their feet. So I think the idea that you have some teams that are in that 5 through 8 range that may be listening and that may get a little desperate to try to add a couple extra picks or may not feel the need to pick right there, and if they can move back and do something, this is where the unpredictability comes in. But I wouldn't expect much until you got to 9 or 10 if you were talking about. I think that the Simmons angle of this makes it more interesting because if you do put a player in there as somebody who can immediately help a team, I think it does sweeten the pot a little bit. I do think that Simmons adds value to that in the sense that, he didn't have the best season last year, especially down the stretch. He was playing through more injuries than most of us can even think of in these situations. So he's going to have that, he adds that value, no question about it. But I don't think that there's any way with just the 2 picks that you're getting anywhere above maybe 9 or 10. And I'm not sure that the Flyers are interested in an increase of 5 spots for both picks unless there's a guy on there basically I look at it, and if to me, I think the only one out of there's three names I have that I would trade up for, consider all things considered. And I'm saying that in the sense that, sure, if Brady Tkachuk somehow slipped and didn't get taken in the top 5 for whatever reason and is sitting there and the 8th pick comes up and here's Chicago, am I trying to find a way to maybe make Chicago an offer to get up and get that kid? Sure I am. But I don't see that happening. I think the top 4 is the top 4. So I take those 4 right out of play. I take Dahlin out of play right away, obviously, because Buffalo is going to take him. And then I look at the next 3 picks down the line, and as long as nothing crazy happens, Svechnikov comes off the board, Zadina comes off the board, and Tkachuk comes off the board. So right away, I'm kind of factoring those guys out. And to me, personally, while there's teams out there that are going to look at Quinn Hughes and get very excited about that, that's another one who I don't see the Flyers as interested in. I'm not taking anything away from the kid. I just think that he fits the mold of so many defensemen that they already have that I don't think that that's the direction that they're looking, even though he is certainly a good talent. So I kind of take him out of play. I look at Bouchard. I look at Dobson. I look at a few other forwards. I look at somebody like Oliver Wahlstrom, and then the Finnish prospect Jesperi Kokoniemi, who is another name who is having his stock rise and is slowly but surely being talked about among the top 5 in some rankings, when he previously had ranked right in that middle kind of 10 to 20 range, depending on who you were looking at. So those are guys I look at and try to, and I think I say, if one of them's available and it's 8 to 10 or 9 to 11 or something like that, get on the phone and start talking to people and see what you can do if there's a possibility. But otherwise, I think that this is much more, I think if Hextall's going to call it an above average draft, and I believe him in saying that because there are some solid names over the middle, it does get a little complicated. But if Hextall thinks it's an above average draft, I tend to lean towards the idea that both picks are getting used and he's either staying with the 14th and 19th or he's finding a way to trade down as opposed to trade up, just to try to continue to build the prospect pool, because that's just his MO. That's just my take. I'm curious to see what you guys have in mind before we get into more names that are probably more likely to be around 14 and be on the board when we hit that second wave of 11 to 20 and get out of the top 10. But I'm just curious to see what you guys think in terms of that, because I don't think there's going to be many options for the Flyers to do the trade up. It may, Dan, it may very well take what you mentioned right at the top. Both picks and Wayne Simmons get you way higher. Maybe then at that point you're looking at a 7 or 8 possibility, but that'd be a pretty extreme cost just to move up 5 spots or 5 or 6 spots, in my opinion. So that's my take on it. At least that's where I kind of stand on that.
I think it's more or less one of those things where, you know, having those 2 picks or 2 picks in the first round is something that Ron Hextall's kind of established that he really enjoys doing. I mean, he's done it several times already so far, and it's one of those things where unless you can find a real out of this world offer, I don't really see him deviating from that. I mean, it's one of those things where, you know, it feels, you look at it at first glance, it feels like there's really not much of a difference between 14 and 19. You know, it's you can't really find anything, you know, any kind of fault with that. But it's one of those things where, you know, if he can get a great offer for, you know, packaging a pick or, you know, one of those, you know, 14 in Simmons or 19 in Simmons or all 3 or what have you. I mean, obviously he's going to do what he's going to have to do there. But I don't necessarily see him deviating from that. I don't really know any kind of circumstance that could see him doing something like that.
I agree with you because Ron Hextall, you know, as we've seen for the last few seasons, he's a fairly conservative GM. He pretty much, he didn't trade Valtteri Filppula when he was in a situation where it was probably beneficial to trade him just in the future aspect, but kept him because you need a third line center, you know, with a team that's, you know, more than likely going into the playoffs like they did. My one question to both of you guys is, you know, it's that, like you said, Kevin, that's an extreme price. 2 first-round picks and the best power forward in the franchise's history since John LeClair. That's an extreme price. But what is the difference in terms of talent? And maybe you can't quite measure it yet. But a top 10 pick, and in this draft, it's kind of like the top 4 and then everybody else, so maybe you don't make that deal. But if a guy like Evan Bouchard does start to slide and you can jump the Rangers, because he doesn't, if a defenseman like him goes to the Rangers, he's going to New York. So can you jump over him to get to a team like Chicago that's absolutely desperate to be good again? And if you throw that Wayne Simmons in there, maybe they'll bite because they're so desperate to be good again. But what is that difference between that number 14 pick in terms of talent in the first round and number 8? Is it worth it in your eyes?
Depends on who it is. And one thing I want to throw in there about the Wayne Simmons angle of this and throwing him in is that let's kind of be careful about the wording at which we even heard the report to begin with. When you sit there and you say they're gearing up to potentially trade Wayne Simmons, that's the quote that we saw on the Athletic. It's, to me, that just says he's out there. If we decide to make a move that involves Wayne Simmons because it's the last year of his contract, we'll certainly listen. It does not exactly scream trade imminent, so I think it's just out there, and it's out there really, I think, at any point for the next year. You're going to hear about this until the trade deadline next year if nothing happens this weekend, next weekend, the rest of the offseason into the following season. You're going to hear about it throughout that process, but I don't think that there's anything imminent with that, and I don't think that they're willing to just move Wayne Simmons for the sake of drafting a kid who's still going to be 2 years away no matter how you spin it. At the bare minimum, also, I'm saying 2 years away in the sense 2 years away from at least probably going pro in that sense. I look at this, and to answer your question, Dan, 14 to something like 8. What's the difference? In some cases, I think that there is a very clear-cut, there's definitely a clear-cut top 4. And then there's from say 6 to 10, there are players within that 6 to 10 group. And again, every team's got their own draft board and could look at somebody else's rankings and laugh them off. So it's very much perception. But I do think that from 5 to 10, those 6 picks that happened there's another wave of players that are available. And this is, like I said, once you get past Dahlin, Svechnikov, Zadina, and Tkachuk, I think Wahlstrom and Bouchard and Hughes and Dobson and guys like that are the next wave beyond that are definitely worth watching as you go through. And I just think that there's certain players that I look at the descriptions, you look at the sizing of the players, you look at some things about, and it's not like it's glaring things about them, but you want to look at style, how much they may have seen that player, how much, all of those factors. And you wonder if there's any price at that point that's worth going up to get that player. It's why one of the first players I think of when I think about that potential to make a trade is Noah Dobson, because of the fact that there's a lot of things that factor in. He is the right-handed defenseman that they are targeting. He's, like I said, he's recently been showcased, so he's got that very recent, very fresh in people's minds that, hey, this kid's got potential. Look at the way that he played in the Memorial Cup. He's got a lot of potential. Then you look at the personal connections that the Flyers would have to Dobson in the sense that he played for Acadie Bathurst. Acadie Bathurst, the GM of Acadie Bathurst is Sylvain Couturier, Sean Couturier's father. He's a teammate of Yerman Rubtsov. There's a lot of reasons that the Flyers would have some exposure to this kid. So that's kind of where I pulled that name from over a guy like Bouchard. Nothing against Bouchard in the sense that if a guy who was projected to be maybe 5th, maybe 6th in the draft earlier in the year, and somehow he's sitting there at 9 or 10, sure, I'm making a call to see if there's any way I can get there. It's just a matter of not overpaying for it. It's the value of the player that you're getting at that time in the draft isn't so great that you would want to make a trade that costs you certainly Wayne Simmons, because of the fact that I don't see how you're helping your team in the here and now coming off a playoff run. You essentially, all you're saying with that is that you've opened up a spot, and by opening up a spot, what are you opening up a spot for? I think there's a big question mark in that regard. I feel like, and like I said, I think you can liken it to the Braden Shen situation a little bit. just because of the fact that when Braden Shen got traded last year, while the Flyers used him as a piece singularly to get the throw-in of the package, which was Yuri Laterra, but also to get a first-rounder in the immediate at 27 overall last year, and then turn the first-round pick that they got that was conditional for the following year and turn it into 14th overall this year, that's more of a Ron Hextall move than moving up. We haven't really seen what he's capable of in moving up other than maybe making a late first-round jump. We don't really see it in this situation where you're going, how are you going to get back into the top 10? It was, I think going into last year's draft, that was a big question also, until the tables turned, the Flyers got some luck on their side, and it wasn't a question of how are you going to get there. You were placed there, and you got a top talent as a result. I don't think the Flyers take that for granted either. I think getting Nolan Patrick last year means you got a big forward, and you got lucky in that situation to move up as high as you did to go from 13 to 2. Take that for what it is, and the fact that you were able to make an effective trade last year, Laterra aside, that netted you Morgan Frost, who was certainly one of the notable junior players across Canadian juniors throughout the year, and now you have an extra first-round pick as well that either serves as leverage to do something in terms of making a move, or just gets you another prospect and probably a better one than your own pick will. So those are the things that I kind of consider about that option to move. And it leads me to focus more on those guys that are really not only could be hit or miss guys in the draft, but you also it leads me to look at the names that are projected to go outside the top 10 and that next wave beyond, guys like Bouchard and Dobson and Quinn Hughes and Wallstrom and guys like that.
So what you're saying is trade, like how Ron Hextall what Ron Hextall is going to do is what he normally does: take the pick and sort of just be conservative and don't allow, don't make the mistake, like in the trade deadline. So many deals that turn out being wrong are the ones that you make on deadline day. So with some of these younger players, you can still get a good defenseman. You still get like a Rasmus Sandin, at 14 or 19. I think that's really more of a 14 pick, but it's not going to be, the handedness, like what you were mentioning at the top of the show. Like you can't go for handedness if you can just get a good defenseman. So with that in mind, like, I know we're running out of time a little bit, so we should probably dive into some players. I just mentioned Rasmus Sandin, a shorter player is. So should the Flyers kind of gun for more, puck moving type defenseman, do you think, guys? Or, should they, try to trade back and get back into the third round? What do you guys think should be the conservative angle to do this then?
Some of the names that I have written down, I have mainly forwards written down, a lot of centers, several wingers, one guy playing who's proven he can play center and left wing. It's one of those things that I more or less have written down more or less just to address depth coming forward. I also have a couple defensemen and a goaltending prospect, just because one of those. While you have guys like Carter Hart and Felix Sandstrom in the wings, it's you don't need a goalie. To go for a goalie in this draft, but you don't not need to go for a goalie in this draft. I mean, it's one of those things where, like I mentioned, depth, but it's one of those things that certainly helps. But that's more or less the angle that I was going with, was just a lot of scoring depth. But obviously, as Kevin mentioned, some we have a focus on right-handed shooting defensemen. I do have one of those on my list as well. So that's something that's just more or less what I have, guys who could be available. Some of these could be some reaches as well. If you want, I can get into those. It's up to you guys.
No, go right ahead. I'm curious. I'm kind of curious to see if your names match some of mine and see where we can kind of agree on some of them.
I've got Rasmus Kupari, who is a center out of Karpate in the Finnish league. Who, fun fact I learned before the show, one of the guys he plays with, Karpate team captain, is former Flyers defenseman Lasse Kukkonen. That's a blast from the past. As Jim Carr would say, a name for all you nostalgia fans out there. I also have a centerman from Niagara in the OHL. I have Akil Thomas. And another name that will be this is a real name for all you nostalgia fans out there. It's a guy whose father has been very, very familiar with the Flyers organization since the 1980s. Matthias Samuelsson, who's a defenseman out of the U.S. National Team Development Program, who is also a commit to Western Michigan University for next year. And going back to Scandinavia out of Luleå in the Swedish league, I have the aforementioned center and left winger is Isaac Lundestrom. Somebody I think I do like that versatility, a guy who can shift back and forth between center and wing. One of those guys who put up modest numbers in the Swedish Elite League this season, but lest we not forget, this is an 18-year-old kid playing in a league for men, so it's one of those things where he's going to be a bit lofty. I have here that in 42 games, 6 goals and 15 points. Not anybody's idea of a perfect pick, but somebody who could be there. And I have also out of the U.S. National Team Development Program and a commit to Boston University next year, left winger Joel Farabee. And the goalie prospect back in the Finnish league with Pelicans, I have. I mean, it's one of those things where you don't know if he's going to be around. He is considered to be one of the top goalie prospects in this year's draft. It's Jakub Skarek. So it's a bonus name that I have is the right-handed defenseman that I promised you, Kevin. It's one of those things where I was more or less drawn to this guy because of his name alone. You look at his kid; he's a kid out of Winnipeg who's a defenseman for Moose Jaw, Jet Wu. It's something where, but by name alone, I wanted to put this kid on my board. But he's somebody who I think he's projected to be a mid to late round pick in the first round. So we'll see how he goes. But he is a right-handed defenseman and somebody who can certainly help out on that front.
Rob, you pretty much crushed my list. The only other name I would mention if the Flyers were interested in trading down in the first round into the 20s is Kjell Samuelsson's kid, Matthias Samuelsson. Big like his old man, but a little bit more offensive punch to his game.
Yeah, I mean, I have Samuelsson on there on mine as well, just because of that kind of connection. And like I said, take the handedness out of it. He is a left-handed shot, but that's beside the point. You're getting a player who so obviously is going to have familiarity with the organization, but more or less just getting a guy, and I agree with you, Dan. I don't think he's a pick at 19. I think he's a drop down. He's a trade down kind of pick, and I could see that happening. Trying to see how many of these I can actually say that I have matched with Rob. I also had Farabee on my list as well, just because Farabee is kind of a confusing one for me, just because I've seen him ranked as high as bordering the top 10, like we're talking 11, 12, 13 for some lists, and I've seen him late first round. So it's all over the map. To say taking him at 14 or 19 is a stretch or not kind of remains to be seen. I have seen a lot of mock drafts suggest that if he's there at 14, that's the pick. Another guy I want to throw out there among forwards, and again, this is a guy who he's listed as a center, but he's got potential to be more than just that or rotate among forward positions. And again, we talked about this with Sandin a little bit, with Rasmus Sandin, the right-handed shot defenseman, because he played for the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds, that the Flyers had a good look at him by going to see Frost play and scouting out some of Frost's games with the Greyhounds, that you get a look at him. You also have another teammate of Frost's in Barrett Hayton, who I think is right in that range for the Flyers. There's certainly some questions about him, but he's a very solid all-around player. Certainly a guy that I would look into. Another forward that I have on the list, I have 3 more that I'm going to get into specifically. Joe Veleno is another one I have on here, just because Veleno was a guy who, from what I came to understand, was projected pretty high in this draft early on. Seemed coming into last season, seemed like he was a clear top 10 prospect and all of that. Started off really, really slow this past year in terms of production, and wasn't really quite off to a good start on his year with St. John. And then a midseason trade in juniors, he goes over to Drummondville and he turns everything around really quickly, ends up having a very productive year. He's not really a top 10 pick, but it makes 14 very realistic all of a sudden. And he's a guy who has been hovering around those mock drafts right at the 12 to 14 range. So if he falls to 14, I wouldn't be shocked if this is the kid the Flyers go with. I also want to throw out their right winger that I have kind of heard some buzz about. I know that he had an interview with the Flyers. He had spoken to them at the Combine, I believe, and had mentioned that among the best that he had, or the longest, or the ones that went the best in his eyes, was his interview with the Flyers, and that's Martin Kaut, who is another one of these European prospects. Got a good look in World Juniors with the Czech team, and again, this is another guy who could just end up making an impact possibly sooner rather than later. He definitely possesses some good high skill level, and is certainly a guy to keep an eye on. And then I also want to throw out another name that I've seen hovering around either pick, really. I've seen him as a suggestion for 14, and I've seen him as a suggestion for 19, and that's Oshawa forward Saran Noel. And this is the guy. A lot of people, when they talk about Noel, it's his size. He's 6'5", 200 pounds, and kind of possesses that power forward size and strength, and goes to the net and does all of those things, and seems to fit that mold of what the Flyers would want in a forward. I just don't know how I feel about him being picked as high as 14. I've seen more and more rankings push him toward the back end, push him towards that 19 might even be a small stretch for him, and 22 might be more realistic. I could see him being the type of pick that the Flyers would make if they turn 19 into a German Rubtsov situation, and you go 19 becomes 22 or 23, and you find a way to turn that 19th pick into another pick somewhere middle of the draft on, a Saturday pick, and drop in the first round to an early 20s pick. So I could see that. And then to round out my group of defensemen, I already mentioned Sandin and Samuelsson, and those are just a couple on there. I've seen Ty Smith floated around a little bit. I just don't know that he's going to be there for the Flyers at any point. And then another name that I've seen floating around, who I think certainly could go at either slot, also either 14 or 19, is Keandre Miller. Just a guy who, again, is another one of these players who's part of that U.S. development group and kind of is making a name for himself in that respect as well. I just think that he's another guy very much in the same kind of class as Samuelsson, in the sense where they're both teammates with that team, and they both have some form of upside. I think Miller's got a little bit more of the offensive side to him, and Miller's definitely not as he's probably got a little less size than Samuelsson, but it's not that far off. The height is relative. The weight class is close enough, quite honestly. So Miller's probably just got a little bit more, I think, of that offensive instinct than Samuelsson does. I think Samuelsson probably qualifies a little bit more as a stay-at-home type. But there's nothing wrong with that either. The Flyers have gone out and in recent years made noise getting players who have that kind of mobility, and there's nothing wrong with having one or two guys in the system who have the potential to be NHLers who are that stay-at-home variety. So I don't see anything wrong with that. And that to me is a bigger deal of that balance. You want to see how they choose to balance it out. There are so many prospects in line that the Flyers could look at who could be available, and it's really hard to put a name on it like it was last year. Obviously, last year it was just a matter of Nolan Patrick or Nico Hischier. It was as simple as that. This year it's all over the map, and trading is an option, and trading up or back is an option, and those are just a few of the names. And quite honestly, we've thrown out probably enough that you would hope that we hit on one of these. But I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of potential names to go to out of this grouping. And if any of the names that we said end up being the Flyers pick, obviously it's something where, like I said, I don't think you're not picking a guy who's going to make an immediate impact. So I don't think you have to shy away from the idea of a work in progress here. You don't want somebody who is that much of a work in progress. I look at somebody like Matthew Strome, who the Flyers took last year in the 4th round, and go, well, at one point in time, he was talked about as a first-round talent, and then kind of dubbed that work in progress with his skating. and it suddenly knocked him to the 4th round. I don't think you're going to find a guy who's that much of a work in progress at this spot, but it's okay to have a guy who needs a year or two of seasoning in his junior league or something like that before he turns pro. I think that part of it's fine. So those are just a few of the names I have. I don't know if you guys have any other names you want to add or any other players you want to talk about as we wrap things up on the show, but the floor is yours for that portion of it for sure.
I just wanted to throw in for Ty Smith, looking at his this past season for the Spokane Chiefs, 73 points in 69 games. That's a lot for a defenseman. So if he can fall for the Flyers, they definitely get a quality but small puck moving defenseman.
I did want to throw in there, Rob, you mentioned on your list too, I think you mentioned Lundstrom, and another name I like as a potential down the road. I don't know about 14 for him. He seems like he's projected more towards that later first round part, but that's another name that I've seen a lot of people throw out there as a possible. And the Flyers have kind of had this thing of building up their system lately, their prospect pool, with some of these Swedish prospects. So wouldn't be shocking if you had another guy like that who has that pedigree coming in and can be a part of it. I wouldn't be shocked to see that at all either.
The kid on my list that I was the most impressed with was out of Niagara, Akil Thomas. If you look at his stats, this was his second season in the OHL, and you look at the numbers. I mean, he played 7 more games this year than 2016-17, but he played 7 more games, only scored 1 more goal. He went from 21 to 22 goals, but his point total 48 to 81. He had 27 assists in his first season and 59 in his second, which is outwardly remarkable. That's a sign, I think, that this kid could really set plays up. He could be a playmaker, and that's something where I'm interested to see if they can pick him up or wherever he'll go. I mean, he's somebody who's definitely kind of stood out to me and somebody I wouldn't mind seeing put on that the orange and black this weekend.
He's an interesting one to me, Rob, because I've seen him ranked lower on a lot of ranking boards, but I almost liken that to with the way you're talking about the numbers. I almost liken that to a bit of an Alex DeBrincat situation. DeBrincat made it to the second day of the draft his year and made an early impact with Chicago when he finally came up. So I don't see any reason why. You have to consider that there are players who, like we said, players are ranked differently on every team's board, and some of these names that may be lower first round names, or people are saying, oh, he might be a late first round pick or something like that, you're going to find guys who slip to day 2. And the Flyers have kind of had a knack on day 2 of really timing things out well to make that move up if they choose to. And they're sitting at 50 for the 50th overall pick to start for their second round pick. But there's no reason why they can't turn something like that into moving up into the mid 40s and going up, say, 6 spots to get somebody who may have lasted. It's around that point anyway when some stuff starts to level off, and then every now and then you'll get a find with one of those types of names, especially if you're willing to move up to get them. I think that's a situation where you might find some of these names. And if someone drops into that area, it might be a go-get-'em kind of situation. That's going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia Podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Google Play, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll be back again next week, recapping the draft, looking ahead to free agency. So once again, thank you everyone for listening. For Rob Riches and Dan Heaning, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast on sportstalkphilly.com. This has been the Flyerdelphia Podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heaning.